Imagine this: a quiet suburban neighborhood, the sun setting peacefully over tidy lawns. A black man is unloading groceries from his car, minding his business, when his white neighbor, peering suspiciously from her window, decides something isn't right. Without hesitation, she grabs a phone and calls the police, convinced he doesn't belong there. What she doesn't know: the man she's targeting isn't just a neighbor, he's the FBI director. This story isn't just about an awkward encounter or a mistaken assumption. It's a window into the uncomfortable realities of bias and the ripple effects of snap judgments. As the situation escalates and police arrive, the tension grows. How will this play out when the truth comes to light? And how will the woman react when she learns the identity of the man she accused? Stick around for a story that will make you think twice about appearances and assumptions. As the police cruiser slowly pulls up to the quiet street, the woman steps outside, waving them over with a sense of urgency. She points toward the man, who's calmly placing the last grocery bag into his home. The officers exchange glances, unsure of what they're walking into, but they proceed cautiously. Meanwhile, the man notices the commotion and turns toward the scene, his face a mix of confusion and mild frustration. He's no stranger to situations like this. It's not the first time he's been judged by his appearance. But this time feels different. He knows the stakes are higher, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The woman, emboldened by the officer's arrival, begins rattling off her assumptions. "I've never seen him before," she insists. "He doesn't live here." The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, approach the man to ask a few questions. Little do they know who they're dealing with. The man watches calmly as the officers approach, his years of experience helping him stay composed. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out his wallet, already anticipating their questions. "Good evening, officers," he says evenly, handing over his ID before they can even ask. The lead officer glances at the ID, his expression shifting subtly as he realizes who this man is. He exchanges a quick look with his partner, but neither says anything yet. Meanwhile, the neighbor, standing a few feet away, continues to press. "I told you, he's trespassing or something. He can't live here." Her voice is sharp, but there's a nervous edge now as she notices the man's steady demeanor. Inside his home, the man's wife peeks through the curtains, concern etched on her face. She knows how easily situations like this can spiral. Across the street, other neighbors start to gather, their curiosity growing. Tension fills the air, but the truth hasn't fully unfolded yet. The lead officer clears his throat, stepping back slightly as he hands the ID back to the man. "Sir, everything seems to check out here," he says, his tone noticeably softer. But before he can say more, the neighbor cuts him off. "What do you mean, checks out? He doesn't belong here," she insists, her voice rising. Her frustration is starting to mix with confusion as the officers don't seem to be taking her side. The man, still calm, tilts his head slightly. "Ma'am, I live here. My family and I moved in 6 months ago. Perhaps you missed the neighborhood welcome." His words are measured, but there's a hint of sharpness underneath. At this point, the officers seem torn between diffusing the situation and revealing the full truth. The neighbor folds her arms tightly, glaring at the man. The tension in the air is almost unbearable as the crowd of onlookers grows. Everyone seems to be holding their breath, waiting to see what will happen next. The man glances toward his house, where his wife is now standing in the doorway, a mix of worry and quiet strength in her eyes. Something is about to give. Just as the officers try to de-escalate the situation, one of them hesitates and looks back at the man. "Sir," he begins cautiously, "I couldn't help but notice the name on your ID. It seems familiar." The man smiles faintly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "It should be," he replies, his voice steady but carrying a weight that cuts through the tension. "I'm the director of the FBI." The officer's face goes pale, and his partner's eyes widen in disbelief. The crowd, still watching from across the street, begins to murmur, confusion rippling through the small group. The neighbor freezes, her confidence suddenly evaporating. FBI, she stammers, her voice faltering. What? What are you talking about? The man steps forward slightly, his posture unshaken. Yes, ma'am, he says, his tone firm but polite. I oversee federal law enforcement across the country, including situations like these. The revelation lands like a thunderclap, and the officers exchange uneasy glances, unsure how to proceed. The neighbor, now visibly flustered, looks around for support, but the onlookers seem more curious about the truth than interested in taking her side. But before anyone can react further, a sleek black SUV pulls up to the curb. A sharply dressed woman steps out, holding a badge. Director, she says with a nod. We've got a situation you need to be briefed on immediately. The man glances at her, then back at the officers and his neighbor, who looks completely stunned. We'll deal with this misunderstanding later, he says, turning toward the SUV, but as he steps away, he pauses. Ma'am, he adds, looking directly at the neighbor, you might want to think carefully about your assumptions next time. The tension now feels electric, with the entire neighborhood frozen in place, waiting for the moment to break. As the SUV door closes behind him, the man looks back briefly, meeting the neighbor's stunned gaze. The officers, still trying to process what just happened, exchange quiet words before deciding to leave the scene. The crowd lingers, buzzing with speculation, as the sleek vehicle drives away. The neighbor, now visibly embarrassed, stands frozen in her driveway, grappling with the fallout of her actions. But just as the tension seems to break, another car pulls into the street, a familiar one, to the director at least. It's his brother, a local community leader, pulling up to drop off a forgotten item. The director signals for the driver of the SUV to stop. He steps out once more, this time with a quiet determination. Approaching the neighbor, he says, I need you to meet someone. His brother steps out of the car, warmly greeting the man. This is my brother. He's not just my family. He's the one who pushed me to understand the power of our roles in the community. And today, he's the reason I even chose to live here. The neighbor looks between the two brothers, her face falling as the weight of her assumptions fully sets in. The director's voice softens but remains firm. We're not just neighbors. We're part of this community. Maybe it's time you started seeing people for who they are, not who you assume them to be. With that, he steps back into the SUV and leaves. The neighbor stands silently, watching him disappear down the street as the crowd disperses, leaving her alone with her thoughts. But the final twist comes when another neighbor, an elderly woman who has been watching quietly, approaches her. Maybe it's time you think about apologizing, she says gently. We all make mistakes, but how we respond to them matters just as much. The scene fades, leaving the audience reflecting on the deeper message. As the street quiets down and the crowd disperses, the neighbor is left standing on her lawn, the weight of her actions sinking in. She glances toward the man's house, where his wife has stepped back inside, closing the door softly. The neighborhood feels different now, heavier, more reflective. Later that evening, she sits at her kitchen table, replaying the events in her mind. For the first time, she considers how her assumptions and quick judgments affected not just her, but everyone involved. Across the street, the director's home is calm, the lights glowing warmly. His family is gathered for dinner, the earlier disruption already a distant memory for them. The next morning, she steps outside, carrying a small plate of cookies. She hesitates, then makes her way to their front door. The simple knock carries more weight than words ever could, signaling a first step toward change and understanding.